what life was like for a samurai warrior in Japan. The samurai have been immortalized in film and literature as the most elite warriors in history. But where did they come from? Who were they, and what made them so special? A different class of warrior. Samurai warriors have one of the longest-running military histories in the world. They were first recognized in the 10th century, and the last samurai laid down their sword in 1876. In the year 792, the Japanese government ended compulsory military service, but the regions were constantly at war trying to gain territory. During the Heian period, the wealthy landowners hired private armies to protect their properties while they were at the imperial court. These private armies were made up of very disciplined soldiers who were devoted to their master. This is how the samurai were born. Samurai means attendant, while the verb samurao means to serve. Soon their job description changed to include fighting bandits and enemies of the state. They organized themselves into groups led by a warlord with political clout. But there was so much more to the samurai than just being an army of mercenaries. The rise of the shogun and samurai. In the 12th century, the imperial court was very weak, leaving the emperor and nobles open to being challenged by the heads of the clans on the large country estates. That challenge came when the two most powerful warlords, the Minamoto and Taira, fought each other to take over control of the whole country. Minamoto Yoritomo won in 1192 and set up a new system of military government led by a shogun, or supreme military commander. The real political power was now held by the samurai. In 1615, the people of Japan had a 250-year-long stretch of peace and prosperity. The samurai didn't need to use their swords to solve disputes. Instead, they meditated and used laws. The shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, issued orders that the samurai had to train equally in arms and polite learning according to the ways of Confucius, a prominent Chinese philosopher. It was during this period that the principles of Bushido, or the way of the warrior, became their code of conduct. This regime of the samurai and shogun lasted an astonishing 700 years. Why were they so powerful for so long? The way of the warrior. One of many ways the samurai stood out from other military units was their code of conduct called Bushido, the way of the warrior. This unique philosophy was the ultimate guide to chivalry. It valued honor, bravery, and selflessness. Devotion to his master meant he had to be willing to lay down his life for him without a second thought. There was no room for fear if you followed the way of the warrior. A samurai's behavior should be self-disciplined, respectful, and ethical. All these ideas were strongly influenced by Confucius. Many samurai were also followers of Zen Buddhism. The samurai's code was the role model for other classes throughout Japan's history. But let's not get too carried away and forget about the reality of war. These guys weren't an army of spiritual leaders. They had courage and great fighting techniques, but many had their flaws. Promises and truces were often broken, villages were burned, and the defeated were slaughtered, as honor came from victory and nowhere else. Also, let's not forget that they were in it for the money and advancing their own careers. Loyalty wasn't always the first thing on their mind, and there was more than one occasion when they would switch sides mid-battle. The way of the warrior was an ideal which many found hard to live up to. The iconic samurai sword. You can't have a samurai without a sword. The samurai sword, or the katana, was the rock star of weapons. There's a good reason why it has a near-mythical reputation. The curved steel sword was made by a master craftsman who controlled the carbon content in different parts of the blade for strength and flexibility. Japanese swords were the finest and sharpest produced in the medieval world. According to Bushido, the curved, slender blade was the soul of the warrior. You often see pictures of samurai carrying two swords, the second having a shorter blade. The pair, known as the daisho, represented the social status and personal honor of the samurai. In the middle of the 17th century, a famous and well-respected warrior called Miyamoto Musashi wrote a book called Go-Rin Sho, or the Book of Five Rings. It's all about using Zen and Tibetan philosophy to help plan military strategy and tactics using both types of sword. The book strikes a chord with a lot of people and is such a hit that it's still in print today. Zen Buddhism had a huge impact on the samurai. Be Zen in battle. From the 13th century, Zen training allowed a samurai to become one with their sword, leaving their brain free. Meditation would calm them and stop them fearing death. They would be at one with the Force. These were not your average Jedi, or I mean soldiers. There are Japanese traditions still practiced today because of Buddhism's influence on the samurai. The warriors took up the Zen tea ceremony, wrote haikus, loved monochrome painting, writing calligraphy, and designing rock gardens. Some samurai were so taken with Buddhist teachings that they gave up their swords and became monks themselves. Samurai were expected to be highly cultured and literate, to be skilled in the harmony of fighting and learning. Over the centuries, they were influencing the people of Japan with their ideas of high literacy and education. An ancient saying that warriors tried to live by was Bunbu Ryu Do, the pen and the sword in accord. They were the influencers of their day. Literacy levels between the 17th and 19th century were higher than in Central Europe. Samurai school. It's not surprising that many parents wanted their children to become samurai when they grew up. That meant training from an early age, a very early age, even as young as 3, with some children using blades by the time they were 5. Their timetable was an interesting mix of physical training, Chinese studies, poetry, and spiritual discipline. The children studied Kendo, which means the way of the sword, the moral code of the samurai, and Zen Buddhism. They had to live according to the way of the warrior, or Bushido. They rode and fought on horseback using a bow and arrow as well as the sword. Girls could also go to samurai school and have martial arts training. Most women didn't go into battle, but they were set up to defend their homes against invaders. Imagine a fly on the wall when an unsuspecting bandit tried to break into a woman samurai's house. Wardrobe and hair. The samurai took great care of their appearance. This was nothing to do with being self-obsessed, but more about self-respect. Their hair was pulled back into a top knot when not fighting. When going into battle, they would shave the top of their heads to reduce the heat under their helmets and wear it straight down the sides. Their everyday clothing was important to show their status, but never flashy. They would often wear a silk kimono with their swords thrust through a belt around their waist called an obi. Indoors, they removed the long sword but would always have some sort of weapon on them, just in case. In battle, their armor was heavy and hot. It was made to protect their torso, thighs, lower legs, hands, and arms. Seems a bit risky, but they didn't want their feet restricted and just wore socks and rope sandals. Their helmets were made from riveted iron or steel plates. Sometimes they would wear a fierce-looking face mask too. The medieval helmets would have symbols representing rank and family. Often you see dragonflies on them as they can't fly backwards, so in the same way, the samurai would never retreat. Decline of the warrior. For centuries, Japan had been cut off from the West, and they liked it like that. Western meddling often meant colonialism, as they'd seen for themselves in China. But in the mid-19th century, the U.S. Navy created a blockade making it impossible to get food in or out of Tokyo, which was called Edo in those days. The Japanese were outgunned, too. Their military hardware needed serious upgrading. Japan was forced to open up its borders and modernize. They had to change their economy, military, and government to defend themselves from colonialism. The Shogun were stripped of their powers in 1868 and the emperor was restored. Emperor Meiji wanted a modern army and stripped the samurai of their powers and their political clout. They couldn't even wear their swords in public anymore. Some samurai did join the army and quickly rose up in the ranks. Others became reporters, writers, academics, or worked for the government. Luckily, they were so highly educated and multi-skilled that they were quickly able to move on to a different type of life once this great era came to an end. Could you have made it as a samurai warrior? Is there a role for them in the world today? Leave your comments below. If you enjoyed our video, then please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on our latest content.